RoseAnn Archibald is the National Chief at the Assembly of First Nations, and she joins me now. Thanks so much for making the time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, good to see you, Wyatt.
You as well. Let's just start out. To what extent are you satisfied? Obviously, when looking at the federal budget today, there's lots of programs. It seems a big focus on things like groceries, things like the cost of living. Do you feel as if, in issues of Indigenous reconciliation were addressed to the extent that they needed to in the federal budget?
There's one area that I really appreciated investment in, and that is missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. There was some funding announcement there for families and advocates regarding the National Action Plan. And I think that that's long overdue. We really need to end this tragedy of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and 2S plus peoples. And so I really welcome that part of the budget. For the most part, the remainder of the budget is really, for me, a cyclical kind of process, and they do call it a budget cycle for that reason. But it's really frustrating for First Nations, Wyatt, because it's really a cycle of perpetuating poverty and third world conditions for many of our communities. It's a repetitive injustice is what it is. And it's this pattern of chronic underfunding of First Nations. A good example is we need $63 billion to bring our housing up to the standards that every other Canadian enjoys, a very reasonable request. And we got less than 10% of the ask for that. There are many examples of this government not really making substantive investments to lift First Nations out of poverty and to create equality and to create equity for us. And so this cycle has to, in my view, end. And we do that by establishing a national prosperity table whose main focus would be on developing a new economic deal for First Nations that's outside of this cyclical budgetary process. All of the wealth that's being generated here on Turtle Island, now known as Canada, is on First Nations and lands and waters, whether it's resource extraction or taxation. All of that wealth is being built upon First Nations lands. And so we sign treaties and have international covenants to share in that wealth. And that has not happened for First Nations. Many people, non-Indigenous people, get to enjoy the wealth and safety and protection here in Canada, but First Nations don't. And, I just wanted to quickly talk about the Amnesty International report, which talked about Canada's track record on Indigenous rights being a national disgrace. And to me, this budget is along those lines as well.
And you alluded to the fact that you believe the repeated pattern of underfunding for Indigenous peoples, for Indigenous reconciliation, kind of in general there. What can the government do to, I guess, provide compensation to Indigenous peoples for, I guess, their sufferings, you could say, for, the repeated underfunding, as you alluded to?
Well, the new economic deal is really about sharing in the wealth of this country. So we have to look at things like the GDP, the revenues that are generated here on Turtle Island, and have First Nations have a fair share of that. And these budgetary cycles are not a fair share of that, because otherwise, if we had a fair share of the resources, which are our birthright, by the way, then we would live in prosperity and not poverty. We would have schools that were of the same standard as everyone else. We would have infrastructure that is of the same standard as every other Canadian enjoys. We would have clean drinking water. More than 34, 35 boil water advisories exist right now. And that's a basic human right, to have clean drinking water. And that's something that many First Nations don't enjoy at this time. And so the new economic deal is what we really need to be working toward.
And then I guess just lastly, before we conclude, overall, as a whole, when looking at this budget, do you see it as a way to potentially, be able to work with the government on, perhaps other federal budget? I mean, did it give you an indication that this could potentially be a stepping stone for programs that could potentially help Indigenous peoples? What did you make of it on that front?
Well, today I'm in Queen's Park, Wyatt, and I had a meeting with Premier Doug Ford where we talked about the success of the Ontario Prosperity Table, which is something that I had worked to establish when I was the Ontario Regional Chief. And we need to transfer that up to the national level. There are ways to approach First Nation issues that will create success. And that's what this government has to begin to focus on, is listening to First Nations and the needs that we have. One of the things that I've talked about as well since I've started my term is to establish a national healing fund. Many of our children, our little ones, are being recovered from these former institutions of assimilation and genocide. I don't call them schools anymore. And that always activates a deep grief and intergenerational trauma. And we need those investments in healing processes so that not only can we move forward in a good way, but I think all of Canada really needs to be on that healing path forward with us.
Okay, we'll leave it there. National Chief at the Assembly of First Nations, RoseAnn Archibald. Thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it, and have a great rest of your day.
Okay, thank you, Wyatt. Take care.